Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining to the session together with Don Sizer, Seth Callender, and Max Anderson, talking about the dilemma about compliance and cyber insurance. How do we collect data for maintain both issues? Um, Max, do you want to present yourself?
Yeah, it's great to, thanks everyone on the line. I'm Max Henderson. I'm one of the co founders and chief data officer of DataStream Insurance. We're a digital broker that works primarily with MSPs and MSSPs in the channel, trying to help them and their customers get cyber insurance. Great to be part of it.
Thank you. Don, Seth?
Hey everybody, I'm Dawn Sizer. We are from South Central Pennsylvania. The MSP is Third Element Consulting. We're about 15 people, and we have two offices that are satellites, one in Houston, and we're putting one in Atlanta right now. So, yay!
Great. Hey, Seth.
Hey, Seth Conder with Kai Security Compliance Group, right out of Denver, Colorado. We're currently at 12 employees, and we do focus primarily in areas of compliance and regulatory oversight. So,
Great. Um, Awesome, guys. So, when you try to implement compliance or insurance to your clients, what is your primary challenges to collect the data that you need efficiently?
Sorry, I can barely hear you, Shy.
Oh, sorry. Hold on. I'm very sorry. Can you hear me better right now?
That's much better.
Yeah.
My bad. Um, yeah. So, in gathering the necessary data, what are the primary challenges that you face? How to collect effectively those data to answering the questionnaires, and what's relevant for compliance controls or the cyber insurance?
Which one of us did you want to answer first?
Feel free, Don.
Okay. So one of the biggest issues that we have is that every insurer that you deal with is different. They all want different things. They all want different information. There's no single source of truth for any of that. So we waste a ton of time gathering the information that, quite frankly, the MSP should not be liable to gather. That the onus should be on the client to do that, certainly not us.
Yeah. Max, what do you see from your perspective when you do the insurance, when you're answering your clients to get the answer on the questionnaires that you send them?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dawn is absolutely correct. One of the challenges right now is that there, cyber insurance as a product, I would still say is quite new, all things considered. So carriers approach trying to assess the risk in quite different ways. This naturally leads to different questionnaires and different frameworks, and this can be challenging for a typical customer using an MSP, because oftentimes to sort of get quotes from the widest possible market means that you're having to fill out a bunch of different applications, and quite a lot of these questions fall into this potential spot where like Don said, I think you can get into places where either the partner helping manage the customer might feel uncomfortable, or their own liability in sticking their necks out and giving some of the information, and at the same time, some of the customers themselves looking for insurance might not have the technical or security knowledge in house, so do need to lean on who helps them to properly answer some of these questions. And frankly, I think from everyone's perspective, these things can be pretty long, for a lot of the purposes of underwriting the risk. So I think there's a lot of challenges there. Fundamentally too, cyber insurance is meant to primarily insure against technological systems, processes, and at the same time, the way we gather data typically right now is from a human being sitting down and answering a questionnaire, more or less. So I think these are some of the data collection challenges.
Great. Seth, what do you think?
Well, I mean, it's, you're opening a whole ball of wax across the board. So gathering the data is obviously there's many ways of doing it. We prefer that the client pulls in obviously anything they must pull in. I mean, whether it's the MSP or the IT side, there's only so many things that we can answer. But then you also with liability, if somebody's signing off on that document, it does need to be correct, but also companies can't expect the MSP or their IT support to finalize and sign off on that, even though their information may have been provided. So there's a line there that needs to start being discussed on how that's going to be handled, because a lot of our clients will just hand it off to us, and we'll do everything we can. We're here to help the client as much as possible. But often in these questionnaires, there's a lot of information that we really shouldn't be touching in that sense. So we can actually help direct the question, or maybe even provide some clarification on some of the questions of what maybe the insurance company is looking for. But again, at the end of the day, even with new regulations and whatnot, the MSPs have to be very careful about what they're actually signing off or checking the box on, because if they're tied into anything as far as any kind of incomplete information, or somebody comes back to be found fraudulent, who is going to be at fault?
Yeah. So, Max, I think it's next question is for you. It's like, when do you asking the client to answer the questionnaires to collect the data? How do you make sure that the data they provide you is actually up to date all the time? And if do they need resend it after a year or after some period of time?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. So it gets again, I don't want to get too in the weeds. So again, where we sit, we operate as a broker, and so typically what we're the most concerned with is making sure that customers going through our system are as accurate as possible at the time of application, and that all of their answers match the actual policies and security protocols they have in place. I think that insurance still isn't exactly, it's moving in the direction of dynamic sort of pricing and risk, where this is something that's further developed in like the auto industry, where you get a car insurance policy and then you might also have something on your phone which is reporting information while you're driving to validate that you're kind of adhering to speed limits, stopping at stop signs, all of that stuff. I think that's closer to where the future of insurance would be, wherein you are, almost having like live agents connected to customer networks that are validating when they might slip out of a previous sort of secure place that they were. Maybe they didn't patch something, a new vulnerability that came out, or maybe for whatever reason, some users like turned off MFA. So now there's like opportunities there. So I think that right now, most of what we try to do is make sure that, things are as accurate as possible at time of application. We, are trying to look more forward thinking and pulling data directly from cyber vendor APIs so we can have more quantitative data rather than, subjective data, again, filled out by a human being. And I think that also helps in making it easier to audit in the future, because you have like very specific endpoints that you'd be referencing connected to certain questions for that customer. But yeah, like, in terms of renewal processes at the moment, the market often won't, require a full on reassessment of a customer when they're going for a renewal, if they're going with the same company. And it would be more a concern if they didn't want to actually take maybe a renewed quote, or had big cybersecurity posture changes, that you'd have to kind of do a reassessment and reaffirm where they were. So yeah, maybe a bit meandering, but the 2 cents, I guess, from my side.
Said so. In your last answer, you mentioned that you are helping your clients to answer what's relevant for your role as an MSP, but at the same time try to make sure about the liability of the answering, right? So in terms of renewals and those kind of things, where does that face you?
Where does the what?
Where does it meet you? Sorry, the
Sorry,
renewals of the answering. Sorry.
So where's it crossing? Like, what are we dealing
Yeah.
with at renewal? Is that what you're
Yeah,
asking?
yeah.
I mean, to be honest, with most of our clients, due to the majority falling under compliance and whatnot, we're really redoing it every single year. It's not, I mean, I believe that through the legal side of it, through the DDQs we have to deal with, and then coming through on these types of renewals, I'm pretty sure it's top to bottom. We may pull up like a previous sheet and double check that things are still in place. But honestly, with things have been changing the last few years, there's quite a bit of movement with each of our clients. As Maxwell is saying, there are a lot of infrastructure changes that are happening right now with, SEC requirements, different compliance changes that make us go in and rip one system out, put another system in, or truly double down on a framework such as SOC 2. So we're making sure that we're noting all of that and adding to all of that. Whereas a lot of other systems or I guess potential applications, maybe it is more of a generic, just verifying the data is correct. But I would emphasize to anybody, if they're going through that process, to truly double down and make sure that you're really double checking everything, not saying, oh, yeah, that's a good checkbox, like adding the extra info if you have it. In today's, and I'm sure Maxwell understands this as well, we internally actually sit down and we spend literally an entire day across 3 or 4 people just writing out our philosophies, how we're changing things, what we're doing internally to make sure that the underwriters understand we're not just about the checkboxes. We are going over and beyond to do things. And if you have a client or you yourself are doing that, you need to make sure you're actually appending that and adding it because it really does help. So we do that for our clients as well.
Great. Don, how do you dealing with it?
So it all depends, right? Kind of like Seth was saying, it all depends on the insurer and what that paperwork looks like and, the questions that are on it. I don't know how many of the applications I've sent back to the insurer and told them that's nice that they want information like that, but it's not clear and I'm not filling it out without it being clear. Period. The end. I'm not letting the client fill it out without it being clear. I mean, Seth's nodding along, so I know he's done the exact same thing.
That's the thing about the addendum I was adding. Like if you need to clarify, sometimes you have to clarify yourself and make sure they truly understand what you're saying.
Exactly. And that's something I won't do. Just from the standpoint of if they don't ask for that information, they don't get it. So I want to make sure that they're asking for the information that they want in a way that I can provide it, but I'm not going to give them additional information that they're not asking for. So I think there's a little bit of give and take and different philosophy there.
The background you come from, I can see how that happens.
Yeah.
Many conversations. Yeah.
Yes. Many conversations. There's a lot of like, we're just not giving you that information unless you ask for it. Now we deal a lot on the legal side and on the criminal justice side. So just different scenario than what Seth is coming from. So it's just different, still compliance based, but different varieties of things.
Yeah. So Max, how do we make sure we're asking the right question, my friend?
Yeah, well, this is where again, like we always feel in the middle. I think it's always a little bit challenging being the broker because you kind of you get maybe beat up a little bit sometimes, like you're making the questions up, but like we're really just trying to make it as compact as possible and like try the technology we built is really trying to make things as simple as possible, guiding along the process and make a single application which can be farmed out to like 30 plus carriers. But yeah, like ultimately people sitting at the broker level don't get to dictate what different carriers are asking for. If those carriers say a question's required, that question's really required to get a quote unless you can give them something else that convinces them they don't need to collect that particular thing. It's just one of those hard constraints, I guess, of the market.
Okay, great. So the next question. So in order to satisfy both compliance requirements and the expectation of cyber insurance providers, Seth, how do you classify and categorize the amount of the data? So, for example, let's assume that your client need to do SOC 2 or ISO, and at the same time you need to do and he asking you, helping him to answer the cyber insurance questionnaire. How do you try to save your time and try to categorize what question is related to other controls, for example, from the compliance perspective?
Well, another loaded question because there's nothing fast about making sure that your clients are properly not only on a framework, but you're documenting it, you're following it, you're reporting on it, which is also something that's kind of newer in the industry now as far as properly creating those reports through systems such as Kamanja, not just doing your spreadsheets and whatnot, but utilizing tools that exist. So I'd say to answer your question as far as efficiency, we're looking into those tools. We're utilizing those tools more than we have in the past because they also allow us to compare different frameworks next to each other. If there's a compliance requirement, it often, especially when we talk about SOC 2, SOC 2 itself is also a framework.
Yeah.
But then you get something like SEC compliance kind of falls more back to NIST with some FINRA rules here and there. So there's some outsiders that we have to pull in, but we'll, I guess maybe internally we'll tie those to different elements of a framework. But circling back around, there's really nothing fast about proper framework mitigation, remediation, whatever else. But in my opinion, it needs to be done. I mean, we have to do it, but as far as the industry is concerned, it needs to be done. And this is another reason when you look at what Max is doing and DataStream and whatever else, the more prepared you can be and the more you can have that ready at your disposal, the faster those types of applications are going to go, in my opinion. Don will probably have plenty on this as well.
Yeah. Don, what about you?
Seth's not wrong. I'm a firm believer in that there should be a framework. You should be using a framework. I don't care who you are. I don't care what that situation is. We're partial to CIS. We like it. Has 3 nice little levels to it. IG 1, 2, and 3. Pick your poison as far as that goes. As far as I'm concerned, insurance should align to CIS. Ask the questions that are in IG 1 and IG 2 as it pertains to whatever client that you're in. It's an easy way of, and I say easy, not that the framework is easy or complying with it is necessarily easy, but it's a nice way that everybody can talk the exact same language and have the exact same expectations. And that's not happening. And I'm really annoyed that, that's just the situation that's out there. What we end up with is we're getting these crazy pieces from the insurance companies, not DataStream, thank goodness, or we would have different conversations, Max. But they're actually naming vendors in some of that, and some of the named vendors are not even, they don't even do what they're asking on the policy framework information. So you're like, oh well, there's this endpoint group. How do they handle your backup? Well, they don't. That's not how this works. So you have crazy stuff like that you're trying to answer, and I've just. It's annoying. It's annoying as an MSP. It's annoying as for the client. And quite frankly, it just shouldn't be happening. So if everybody would just align to CIS, we wouldn't have this problem.
And also add as a stepping stone, just aligning to a framework to start, because right now I think a lot of insurance companies somehow are still just dealing with best practices or what they feel obviously may be their largest pain points, obviously financially or whatever else. And that, I mean, they have to do that from a business perspective, but we have to start somewhere, and I'm seeing less and less companies actually ask about frameworks, even if this, then that. Like you choose a framework and you can fill out based on what you're doing on that framework would be paramount. I mean, it'd be huge compared to even just everyone agreeing to one framework. I'm not against that either, but we have to start somewhere because this is not going away. Obviously, this issue, companies having these problems with insurance, understanding what they need to do. We won't even walk into a new client unless we sit down and talk about what they did on their last application and whatnot to make sure that they were telling the truth and all that kind of stuff to make sure that you guys, just if any of this happens until your renewal, we're not backing, in a sense, we're not backing you or we're not standing behind this because we're telling you up front. We will actually write something to that as well saying you cross off a bunch of checkboxes that don't actually exist. And it's a concern, so following something, if they can come together on something centralized, it'd be huge.
Yeah, I know. In other conversations, Don and I and others have definitely, and it sounds like you as well, Seth. It's just like I do think the lack of. I think this is one of those hard things where it still feels like all the incentives need to line up a little bit better for kind of like everybody. Because I think something that doesn't exist right now is like standardization for the insurance world yet. Like obviously we've already talked about that. I think part of the reason is that these insurance companies each individually, I guess, whenever they put a product out or sort of they are risking their own neck, financially speaking, such that like if they don't feel like they've properly evaluated the risk, they can lose a lot of money. And I think that leads them to maybe search for, I don't care what the framework is. I want to know the questions that are going to actually cut to the heart of like who's better or worse a risk. But I think unfortunately there has been these growing pains where some of the people that are helping the insurance companies ask the better security questions weren't necessarily there all the time at the beginning to help sort of shape that path and growth. But I agree. I think like what it feels like the whole industry would really benefit from are, you know, the floor keep getting higher. Like if you meet some kind of basic standardized criteria, you're kind of gonna guarantee good quotes, and also like, you know, you should feel pretty good about that security standard if you're meeting this, because a lot of people don't. And you know, again, something like the CIS framework, again, I like some of those things where there's also like tiers to it, so that people can almost, you know, crawl, walk, run a little bit too with different frameworks, where you wouldn't also necessarily have to change 50 things overnight. You could have something a little bit more tangible and then try to level up from that. And there could be incentives to also level up, because, you know, the more secure up the ladder you go, the better premium discounts you could expect on average, or something like that would also be like useful. I think some of the things I've liked about the Kamanja world is that they at least, do bridge some of that compliance mapping stuff. Like it's nice to be able to have essentially artifacts that can map between a CIS and a NIST and other frameworks, and that be relatively painless, so that if they did have to sort of export that towards whatever framework you needed, you're not having to reinvent the wheel. You're more deciding like how you structure the data in whatever output kind of form you want. And, you know, that would work well in an insurance world, as long as, they sort of choose which framework they align a little bit more towards, and hopefully it simplifies that problem a little bit.
To go back to the earlier comment, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'll go after you.
The comment about us adding kind of an addendum, part of it has to come with what you're saying is, you know, not having a standard. You know, the insurance industry and the cybersecurity side has been the Wild West for over a decade now, and I think it's kind of clearing out, but we still have a lot of companies trying to sort out what are they willing to cover. It's changing all the time. Did they ever truly invest in what it actually means to cover these things? Or was it always like, hey, we're gonna get into it because we see a new industry, but did they ever really back it up with what they need to? And we see it all the time in the MSP world. So that's one of the reasons we add that addendum, because we're adding, like, so we are internally, we're SOC 2. So we add all of that because if that question's not on there, we want them to understand, like, look, we are also doing these things because there isn't a standard. Now, we may not go out of our way, as Dawn actually suggests. In my opinion, I agree with her. I wouldn't go add a bunch of extra information that may tie you into something as well. But if we say, hey, we're SOC 2 because we want to get the best rates, and every year we get offered a larger umbrella, like I know that's actually becoming less frequent now. We go through that process so we can internally expand that. And we talk to our clients about it as well. It's up to you what you want to put on this. But if you are doing something that's unique, that's not even being asked, just make sure it's not something that maybe ties you into something you're doing, that they come back later and be like, oh, you said you do this, but you don't, which I'm assuming is what Dawn is coming from. But also it helps kind of maybe help you standardize maybe what you're doing for your clients and whatnot, that may help stand out a little bit to get those better rates if that's a concern, or maybe get better coverage, which I know is being pulled from more and more companies these days. So sorry, Dawn, go ahead.
No, quite all right. So I guess where I was circling back to was I don't understand why insurance companies don't look at frameworks more intensely. Like there's actual data out there that says if you were following a framework, your chance of breach or incident is like 94% less likely. It would seem like this is a no-brainer, right? Like it just doesn't seem reasonable that they wouldn't do that. And I guess the other part to that is, you know, Max, one of the things that you said is the insurance industry is still quite young. And from the MSP world, we look at that and think, y'all have been around for like 10 years doing the same thing. That's ancient in our world. What is your problem? So like there isn't a correlation between the speed at which we run and the insurance industry. And I think there's a lot of miscommunication that goes on there because of that. So, you know, we look at it from we can see the data. We know exactly where this is going. Just align to a framework. You'll be fine. Your risk comes way down, and, you know, so on and so forth. So I guess it's just that we expect and or anticipate other industries to run at the same speed that we do. And that doesn't always happen. And it's very frustrating on our side.
We also live within the threatscape, and the insurance companies, like as you're saying, are kind of slower to move. So that's why I think we're seeing a lot of them pulling out too, because they didn't properly prepare themselves, you know, 5-10 years ago, especially 10 years ago, it was much milder, obviously, than it is now. So having these new threats come in and change, if they're not truly investing in what it means to support all companies at this stage, not just companies like ours. I mean, yes, us going in and getting insurance is different than our clients because we're also offering that support. There's other layers that we have to answer. Depending on the industry our clients are in, they obviously have different lines of questioning as well. But it is a huge gap between the growth in our world and the growth in that world. And it's actually a little, it's a bit scary, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I do think you're right. There's like fundamental not shocking that insurance is a bit of a slower industry in general. And I think also what doesn't help is that like it does not speed things up when they also lose like lots of money. So I think like one of the issues, for instance, was like in 2020, you could make an argument that hey, some of these, some of these carriers they didn't properly assess different scenario modeling events, and so a bunch of them lost more money than they made, especially in the early days of the pandemic, because so much moved digital and a lot more hackers started doing ransomware, etc. But it is also this complex challenge for the insurance world where they're sort of trying to, you know, calculate probabilities of losses of things that haven't actually happened in the real world yet, which does I think put you at odds, like you were saying. I think they operate a little bit on a different speed because they're almost solving a problem that unfortunately there's this massive lag time on being able to really understand the impact of things. And like you said, I think that there's not a question that certain security protocols really do reduce certain types of events. But I think the challenge is like, well, what happens when you start normalizing for size of industry and like size of the company and like we've done, our parent company sits on one of the world's largest, if not one of the largest, like claims and policy data set. And my background's much more in the machine learning world and trying to build models on top of that. It's a non-trivial problem to feel really confident about how to weigh all those factors simultaneously while also saying, hey, the world could change if there's some new big attack vector or something globally shifts the world, like big wars or other things like that. So anyway, I think it is one of those things where I think it's like it's one of those places. I think if both sides can kind of understand each other, that will help. But I think you're right. There is a speed difference, and I think that like insurance, as much as they can, needs to try to catch up and seem in line with how the MSP world grows and moves, because I think they rightly so feel slow from that perspective. I'm sure a lot and outdated sometimes at times as well. My guess is.
If you look at all the models they work with across, whether it's auto, home, life, I mean, those models have existed for a long time, and there are changes within them, obviously, environment, all that kind of stuff, but they're pretty sound. IT is chaos, so they're basically ensuring chaos. We understand that, but they got to catch up to the chaos. Basically, how they do that.
Like chaos insurance is a good. They maybe should have changed the name. Better marketing right off the bat.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to be clear that like, we're not pointing fingers in any way, shape, or form. That's not what we want to do here. But it is, like I said, it's very shocking some days at how slow the speeds actually are and where they're basing some of their data from. So I know a lot of the data modeling that insurance companies do, they do it at the enterprise level, and very, very small amounts do they do at the small and medium business level. But the reality is that when you look at, yes, the enterprise is a much bigger target, it's a much bigger whale, it's much more. You only need one of those to live off the land for a while. But the reality is that small and medium business is attacked much more often because it's a much easier target, right? So stealing a Lamborghini, hard, right? Stealing an unlocked Chevy, super easy when you look at the two. So not having the data, and they're not using the data that they have available to them to model either, which again, it's that shocking chaos kind of thing that is going on in the IT industry that obviously we'd all like to see change a little bit, because I think it makes our world better, it makes your world better, and quite frankly, the client world way better, and take some of the onus off of the MSPs to provide some of that data.
Yeah. So what Max team and Kamanja team tried to do in the last couple of weeks is actually mapping those serious control to the cyber insurance world and try to streamline all of this process and helping the MSPs and their clients say, okay, if you're just answering few simple questions on the CIS, you gathering and collect the data, we automatically telling you how far do you feel all the rest of the question that the data stream asking. So, and I think that, Mac, maybe you can talk more about it. I think we are on a good path about it, and um, we did a lot of mapping already, and it's been improved already, which also simplify and streamline all of that process. And it's right to Don point. So I totally agree with you, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah. At risk of obviously taking way too much of this time talking myself, but yeah, I think one of the things we've been trying to build together is closer to that world where, right now, like our universal app, it's not 100% based off of any one framework, but something that we think is a good step in the right direction is that we figured out that, hey, if you're sort of like really aligned to CIS and you're a Command user, if you want to press the easy button and export a bunch of artifacts that map to basically 40% of the current questions that we have in our own questionnaire, that can be done with a click of a button. And then that's a really strong artifact if you ever actually have a claim, because now you have some good evidence that an auditor can come in and see that, yep, you're still, basically the same position you were at the time of application. And you can see these proof points against these different questions. So I think like solutions like this hopefully make it much easier from the end user's perspective, takes a little bit of the load off of also the MSP that is having to typically, again, handhold a little bit with some customers going through the insurance application process. But provides at least, like, I think what the future should look like for this industry, which is that we have figured out how to standardize a bit what types of information to answer these questions. And as much as we can, we're building technological solutions that are naturally extracting data and in a consensual way, obviously, wanting to collect consent from both the partner and the customer before exporting any of that data and keeping it quite secure. But like that feels closer to how the future of this application process should look, more standardized and more driven by technology, basically.
Great. Don, what do you think once it will be released?
Who was that question for? Sorry, Shay, you're still a little shy. You're a little quiet.
Sorry. I mean, Don, what do you think once it will be released, if that will help you with answering the cyber insurance questions?
So what I think is going to happen, again, it all depends on the client, right? Let's say that we have a client that doesn't want to adhere to the framework and doesn't want to spend the money. Now what?
Yeah, but if, from my perspective, if we map the CIS, for example, and the answers are, and the questions, sorry, are quite the same, and some question is not clear for the cyber insurance, then you have some reference from the CIS and telling, okay, if it's mapped to the CS control, now can I understand better what they are asking, if that makes sense to you.
Right. It does. I think it's just, there's always going to be a disconnect on any industry that doesn't have to be held to compliance kind of things, right? So you're going to fight that battle no matter what that is, because telling people, well, if you just align to CIS, it'll be so much easier to get insurance. Okay, so I'm going to spend $30,000 for a $5,000 policy. Who would do that? No one, right? That's not going to happen. So I think there's give and take on the compliance side of things. Like, and please don't get me wrong, like, I don't think that there's ever going to be a situation where you press the easy button on compliance and it's just going to magically do it itself. That's not going to happen either. However, when you're looking at maybe compliance light, right? Here's all the things that we can gather through the network, through some checkboxes, those kinds of things. We can see that it's turned on. We can see what this looks like. We can see our Microsoft scores. We can see this, we can see that. And if we gather that all together in some type of platform like Kamanja or any of the other ones, that we can then feed back to an insurance company without the artifacts, without the additional documentation, but we can see that it's actually happening. Is that enough for the folks that don't have to be compliant?
Yeah.
And we have been having a conversation lately with a lot of MSPs about even if your client isn't ready to go full CIS or full whatever, you should still be moving them towards that. Start putting them into these systems and figure out where they're at. And even if they're not ready to do it, say complete it in 3 to 12 months, you could still potentially get them there through a time frame. But you have to start somewhere, and you got to start now. And regulations changing, potentially insurance. Maybe, I mean, if regulations change enough, maybe insurance will be forced to follow something. But MSPs are also falling behind because, to Don's point, no one's willing to really do it. So a lot of companies out there, I believe, aren't taking the actual proactive step to even start tracking the frameworks. Even if they don't have to be on one, they have to start somewhere. And we keep kind of reiterating that because these are the reasons why. And when regulations finally do hit, say you have to be this, then everyone's playing catch up, and that is a whole different ballgame. So just
I think there's going to be a shift probably in the next year or two. And I know Seth and I have talked about this on the regular of there will come a point where the MSPs are going to kind of, separate themselves, wheat from chaff kind of thing. And there's going to be a couple that rise above and the rest are going to fall away, because if you're not following along, if you're not becoming compliant, if you're not following a framework, people are going to take a hard look at that. And whether it's a client, whether it's an insurance company, whether it's supply chain folks, right? Maybe it's the people that we're doing business with. Maybe it's our PSAs. Maybe it's, folks like Kamanja. They're like, you know what? We aren't touching you with a 10-foot pole if you're not compliant in some way, shape, or form. I don't want you connecting into my tools if you're not compliant, and that's something that's going to come for everyone eventually.
Part of the trend we're seeing between, even our colleagues, Don and I, and again, these colleagues, we're forced to be doing that now. It's kind of like, in a sense, being on the front lines. And if you look through the history of the last 20 years, when it comes to regulations and compliance and things that are being required, we're always about 3 to 5 years ahead, where we have to do things because it's by law. But we're also seeing those regulations start to change faster. So most companies are coming in behind now, starting to follow some like the best practices and whatnot. You have to have this, you have to have that. The things that insurance is requiring just for general applications, those are start shifting towards what Don and I already have to deal with on a daily basis. So understanding what those are and starting to look ahead, that's why you have to kind of start now as well, because if the regulations come through, that's going to escalate quickly. But also, it's never going away. It's always coming down. So some of us may always have to do more than others, and that's the industries we decided to work in. But it still always has a tail behind it, where everybody eventually is still following up to that. And we're to a point now. We talk about trends and people being behind. You can't keep your head in the sand forever and just say like, oh, well, we'll get to that when it comes. Because when it comes, you're going to be in pain when that comes. Some of us are already there, but then also we have our niches. So it's not really a concern. What was the big shift recently with, we all know what the big shift recently that happened with dealerships and whatnot. That was like, hey, it's got to happen now. How many of those dealerships followed through? How many of them said, oh, well, what's the actual cost variance? Are we really going to do it? This has happened with other industries too. I'll call up medical. For years, people doing the bare minimum, hoping they don't have to have a HIPAA audit or whatever and getting by on it. But that gets to be sketchy.
Let's talk about accountants, right? And some of those requirements. I can still tell you, like, we're still doing work for accountants. Like, they haven't done it yet. That's just how it is. Like, they're catching up. And that was, what, a year ago?
Yep.
When the deadline was to comply. And
the regulations are changing enough in the States, at least, because, with Shy being overseas, the MSPs are starting to get fined. They're starting to say, hey, it's your responsibility to make sure your clients have X. So it's not just signing a waiver anymore saying, oh, they didn't want this. And then what happens when someone shouts from the treetops that you screw them over and you're like, well, they signed a piece of paper. Insurance companies aren't going to care about that. Yeah, government doesn't care about that, and your reputation doesn't care about that. You're there to support them and make sure they have what they need. Then we come back to the standardization of stuff that Max was talking about.
So while we're on that soapbox, let's also talk about the clients that don't want to do what they are legally required to do, right? What do we do about them? Because you can offboard them all you want, but I guarantee you there's going to be somebody there the either next day or the day before you offboard them saying, we'll do it. Well, it doesn't matter to us, right? So there's that race to the bottom of folks that obviously either don't care about compliance, they don't care about their clients' compliance, and they certainly don't care about their own, or they wouldn't have taken them on. So how do we as MSPs, talk about that? Because it's a really valid conversation that we need to be having, one amongst ourselves, like, stop doing that. That's idiotic. You're going to kill your business eventually. But also with our clients, like, this is what's actually going on in the industry. This is what you need to be aware of. Sure, Joe down the street is totally going to be, you know, less expensive, but here's why.
And Max, I'm not sure, you know, we've been a partner with DataStream for a long time, but, you know, are you guys able to drive some of this? Because the other side is this is where insurance can get kind of back into the driving force of making these changes. You know, it's not just like maybe they're behind in some areas, but this is an area they start. We know they're already requiring things, but to start saying like, no, I mean, if you are not going to do these things, it's not just about insurance, but the other thing that may happen is we know in some industries, if you have to meet building codes or whatever else, if you find a building code infraction, there's some areas where if you don't report it, you're just as liable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that may start happening with IT. And that's a whole other level of pain that MSPs, I don't think, are ready for.
Yeah, I think like both Don and Seth, I think making good points around like I think like one, it does feel like there's different things that hopefully are squeezing people into being more compliant and more secure in a good way. I think one of the things we've seen, aside from sort of like new legislation coming out, is simply that other businesses are getting smarter. Like quite, you know, a considerable part of new customers coming to us are not coming because of government saying you have to do X, Y, or Z. It's hey, we want a big contract, and they're requiring better like insurance or whatever around that. So I think there really is kind of like a, you know, put your money where your mouth is power here, where if in general people are responding to what actually, you know, more how the world should look from the security compliance side and making it more a requirement to do business, that's a big mover. And I think you're right, insurance should continue to shape this. We always talk about Ben Franklin and fire insurance because in some sense, you know, that was their attempt to force people to do things that would actually cut down on fires. Like, hey, you can cut down on your catastrophic risk, but you cannot get fire insurance if you don't have access to your roof or like a better type of stove and things like that, because they had identified, hey, these are the things that are leading to these massive, huge economic losses in these big cities. So I am really hopeful because insurance feels like the right stick to try to use to force people to actually do the right things, especially if insurance becomes a bit of a required link in their broader business, you know, network where, you know, insurance is becoming something that you need for certain contracts. And then if insurance is both required and then can require you to do things, which it didn't 5 years ago, like MFA has gone from, you know, could have to now pretty much must have, or you're just not even going to get quotes from almost all the carriers. So slow again, very slow compared to probably the pace we'd like to see, but it does feel like there is this motion there that hopefully helps everyone.
Yeah, and I'm sure Seth has the same issue going on, but I mean, most of our clients that have any type of compliance, like we have to provide insurance certifications from, you know, both our regular, you know, errors and omissions, but also our cyber insurance. Everything has to have, you know, documentation for them. So I guess it just comes back to that whole, make sure that you're, you know, every client that you're talking to, you should have this on file from us. This is why, this is what it looks like. This is what it should look like. You know, somebody of our size should have this much insurance. This is why we'd want someone, you know, the conversations are really varied and long, and some clients don't care. They just want that bottom dollar price.
They're not sexy. Sorry, but no one wants to talk
No,
about
they're
it.
not
But
sexy.
there's not a lot of what we do in our world anyhow that is exciting for clients to don't talk about unless it's some growth or some new fun technology. But you got to have the conversations. And this is one of the last ones I think people usually have because it's probably one of the most boring to go through. You know, so.
It's
Yeah,
like
nothing is sexy in our industry unless it has a hoodie and they're banging on a keyboard. Like that's when it's cool and fun, but that never actually happens.
it's like Don, it must be some standard for being an MSP client, minimum requirement for being an MSP client.
Yeah.
So yeah, and if you're not doing that minimum, you can be our client. It should be something that all the MSPs around the globe should do. And yeah, but
We've
I
gotten
think
to
it
that
will be
point.
hard.
Yeah, I mean, we've gotten to that point. We have certain requirements, like you're going to do X, Y, Z, or you just can't be our client. It's too much liability for us, and it's too
Yeah.
much liability for you. And I know Seth does the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, in the industries we focus on do require, but remember too, we'll have conversations with clients about their cyber insurance, and it'll be, you know, it often comes down to, I think you mentioned a little bit on this earlier, Dawn, is your cyber insurance may cover an incident, and they'll be like, well, we pay for it, it's enough. It's like, well, the problem is it's not just the cost anymore. First of all, you can get dropped like you can in any other industry now. I mean, for a while, PCI was like you could have 3 or 4 incidents before they really started having issues. That was a while. I mean, 20 years ago. But point being is that's changed. The next thing is no one talks about the reputation loss anymore. I mean, there may be enough ransomwares when else happening now, but if you're in a certain industry and you get ransomware or you have investors and whatnot, and you have a problem like this, it's more than just, hey, our policy covered it and our rates may go up a little bit. The cost can be astronomical. And that needs to be part of the conversation too. And sometimes that's what brings them to the table to really have the discussion. Say, this is what we're seeing, to really make these things get pushed through and have the clients understand the gravity of what it really means to make sure you're being covered. And we're meeting all these criteria. Well, do we really need it? We never had an incident. Well, that's why we did everything properly. That comes up sometimes too. Why do we need you anymore? Well, did you get hacked? That's always a fun conversation.
Yeah.
Great. Great. So we're running out of time. Thank you very much. It was a great discussion, guys. Seth and Don, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. You're amazing. Thank you, Max. Last thing that you want to say, or?
No, this was really fun, and I think I think we're all hopefully in all of this for the same kind of aligned thing. As much as some of the incentives aren't aligned, maybe sometimes with very pieces of the puzzle here between the carriers and the brokers and the MSPs and the customers. I think the side, at least, that does feel like there's a huge alignment is that we all want to be able to have those end level customers just thrive in that digital world and have everybody safe. And I think we're trying to figure out how to build industries around that, because that makes a better world. So it's fun talking to people and hearing the different perspectives. And I think everyone's kind of elevating their game in a different way. Hopefully it's, more MSPs again, having their own standards and pushing back on customers that don't do it, and more carriers that are asking better questions, aligned to better frameworks. And so fun discussion.
Great.
Agreed. Thanks for having us, Shai.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Have a good one.